Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2250, Robinson Chapter 13, Converging Biracial and Multiracial Identities. So now that we have been focusing on individual ones, we're going to talk a little bit about the fact that in modern times, and especially in America, because we're so diverse, is that people are going to become biracial or multiracial, right? There's a shifting construct in American society about this. Initially, there was a really fun game, I guess, or interesting game, where I would play in class with you guys, where we would try to guess people's ethnicities and stuff. That website has now been taken down, or it doesn't work anymore. But there is another one that is a YouTube video where they ask people to try and identify people in a lineup of what kind of ethnicities. And it's fun because we're so curious about where people are from, right? But depending on the tone or the questions that we ask, it might be seen as rude. So we want to be respectful. We want to be, respectful of just all people in general, and to learn how to talk to people in a way where they're willing to talk to you, open up, and share. So please click on this link, take a moment to watch it. It's really fun. You can play along with it as well. Know that it is all in good nature. How sometimes we think that we're really good at telling who are what, but then we learn that we can fail miserably. So let's talk a little bit about some of the definitions. Biracial is a person who has parents from two different racial groups. So it might be someone who is white as a parent and then an Asian parent, right? So that child will be biracial because they have one white parent and one Asian parent. Intraracial are two people from within a racial group. So that could be a Mexican parent and a Salvadorian parent. So it's within the same, let's say, Latinx group, but it's not the same actual countries, right? So it could also be Japanese and Chinese, or French and English, or something like that, okay? Next one is interracial, a family comprised of people from different races. So that would be African American mother and a white father or Caucasian father, and their biracial children. So we're talking about an entire group of 3 people or more. That will be considered interracial. Obviously, if the mom is Black or African American, that's 1. And if there is Caucasian, that's just 1 itself as well. But then when they have children, then the entire group will be considered an interracial family. Okay? Monoracial is a person who identifies as being from one racial group only. So a person who identifies as Caucasian. Bicultural is a term that is also used to describe one of the acculturation strategies. Can refer to a person who may be bilingual, right? So they might speak Arabic, Hebrew, and French. So that would be bicultural. Okay. Multiracial is a person with multiple races. So this person might have Asian, Caucasian, African American, and Native American in them, right? So that would be multiracial, more than 2, basically. And then multicultural is when someone celebrates or has values of more than 2 cultures. So let's say that they are, a bunch of different ones, and so they celebrate all of those holidays and respect those cultures at the same time. So that would be considered multicultural. Let's talk a little bit about demographics. 2000 census report 1 or more of the following races: white, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, or some other race, or SOR. So this is report 1 or more of the following in the census, okay? 9.1 million or 2.9% of the US population reporting more than one race. 92% reported having 2 races. 8% reported having 3 or 4 races, and less than 1% reporting having more than 4 races. So 4 might be a little too much right now, but in the future it actually might be much more common, right? Because those children who are biracial will maybe potentially have children with other biracial children, and suddenly there's a lot more diversity in those families. And it's so interesting, right? 20.4% are white and Black when it comes to being biracial. 19.3% are white and some other race. 18% is white and Asian. 15.9% are white and Native American and Alaska Native. There is on page 252, the table 13.1, for race combinations for 2010. It's just a table with all the different combinations that people reported in the census. Foreign-born population has contributed to the racial and ethnic diversity of the U.S. That's true. When immigrants come into America, they start to live within the country, within the communities, and they meet people, fall in love, and then make babies, right? Some of them do. And so, again, it adds to the diversity of our country, which I think is kind of cool. Traditional immigrant destination states: California, 10.2 million, New York, 4.3 million, Texas is 4.1 million, Florida is 3.7 million, New Jersey is 1.85 million, and Illinois is 1.8 million as well. Majority of people who are immigrants live in the West at 40%, South 27%, Northeast is 18%, Midwest is 15%. Here are some additional information about people. Black men, 22% marry outside of their race. Black women, 9% of women marry outside of their race. Asian men, 20% of married outside their race. And Asian women, 40% marry outside of their race. White and Hispanics have no gender differences. So in that sense, it's the same for both males and females. Now let's talk about the one-drop rule, which you might have heard of, but you might not necessarily know what it's all about. Let's explore. Emerged in the South during slavery, disallowing a white identity to anyone who has had 1/16 black ancestry, regardless of physical appearance. So what that basically is saying is, even if you look white, right? If we can look down your family tree to several generations, and if someone there identifies as black or is a black person, that means that you are black as well, okay? People were considered black not only if either of their parents were black, but also if their only black ancestor was a great-grandparent. So they're going to track the lineage to the great-grandparents to see if there's anyone who is black, and that will make you 1/16 black. And again, it doesn't matter if you look white. So there's a whole world of people who are passing, right? And I'm not saying that it's good or bad either way, obviously. Do you guys all know Halle Berry, that beautiful actress? Well, she was in a movie called Queen, which is part of Alex Haley's Roots series, or the author, Alex Haley. And it talks about a young woman who basically can pass as a white person in her struggles during that time period. And Halle Berry is the actress in that. It's actually the first movie I saw Halle Berry in. There's also a caste system, just like in all the other cultures that we've talked about before, where people think that certain people are better than others, right? So in the biracial group, this is the thing. And the first one is mulattoes, which are one black parent and one white parent. So basically 1/2 ancestry. Quadroons are one black grandparent and 3 white grandparents, which means 1/4 black ancestry. And octoroons, which are one black great-grandparent and 7 white great-grandparents, which becomes 1/8 black ancestry. Okay, so again, here's just some math. I would not encourage you guys to just start calling people out mulattoes or quadroons or octoroons. They are very sensitive. I've heard people not feel very good hearing these terms, but I'm just teaching you this because obviously we're learning about what was going on back then, and to be aware of where these words come from. Society has difficulty with multiracial individuals' alignment with more than one racial identity. What that basically means is when a person is biracial, our society kind of calls them or identifies them as with one only, right? So let's say that the person is half black and half white. A lot of people, and even they, might identify as just black instead of black and white. And that's a weird rule, weird systemic issue that's racist, right? We want to celebrate both cultures if possible. So again, that's what this comment is basically saying. The rigid and binary notions of race are being contested today, which is fantastic. Social justice is talking about the fact that we should be proud of who we are, right? And before, when we identify, let's say, half black and half white, and then identifying as black, which is considered the lesser of the two, now people are saying, I am proud to be black, I am proud to be Latinx, I'm proud to be Asian, I'm proud to be Native American. So we're now celebrating it instead of being kind of embarrassed and then identifying with what's considered the lower of the group, right? And that's wonderful that we start to have this pride in our cultures and not be ashamed or let other people put us down. So let's talk about the two links that I have here. One is with Trevor Noah, and he is a really brilliant comedian who is on The Daily Show. His mother is South African Sosha, black, and his father is South African Dutch, I believe. And so he is biracial, and there is a clip, it's a couple minute long clip, it's not very long, when he moved to America and when people were asking him to identify who he is at the bank. Okay, and then the next one is called Twins, Maria and Lucy. They're non-identical twins, and if you look at that picture of them on the top right there on the slide, you'll notice that one has more black or African American or African features, black curly hair, and then the other person has straight red hair and is lighter skin. So that's really interesting in itself, right? However, if you watch it, you'll hear the interviewer, the journalist, say something to the one who looks more white that is probably a microaggression or is a microaggression, but she did not realize how rude and inappropriate what she said was, although, you know, she just said it out loud, right? And part of it, again, is that we as a society have been taught to value white skin or lighter skin or white identifying things more than anything else. Again, things have changed, and the news reporter did apologize afterwards. But please watch the video and listen to it. I'm not going to tell you what it is. Mulattoes were considered black due to a concept of hypodescent, which means that biracial people are assigned to the social group with less social status. Like we said before, when you are black and you're white, you're considered black, right? So this idea, this concept, is called hypodescent, and it's been around for a long time. None of this stuff is new, and I want you guys to realize that people have been aware about these things for a very, very long time. It's not new concepts whatsoever. Let's talk about the fluidity of race. So the word fluidity, think about the word fluid, which is like water or liquids. And when you shake liquid around, it just moves around, it bounces around, it makes splatters. But when you let it go, it just goes back to that puddle again or little container, right? So that basically means that it moves around and it's still the same thing. And it will come back or it will move, it'll shift, but it will always be the same as well. It doesn't really change. So the confusion exists as to who is considered multiracial. Like class, social experience, and custom, it is not static. So things like all those things, you can actually move and control it, right? But then it adds to who you are as well. Just imagine a person who is, let's say, black and white living in France, and then they move to America. So do you see how fluid that is? People just move around. So who are they? The multiracial component becomes much more heightened because of those things, right? And this link right here is about a National Geographic article, which is really interesting about this idea of fluidity of race. Problem approach. Sees non-monoracial groups as marginal and susceptible to poor psychological outcomes. So again, this is how people unfortunately see this, such as low self-esteem, an inferiority complex, and hypersensitivity, which means they're very, very aware of things, especially about their biracialness or multiracial issues. After the 1970s, racial pride and interracial marriages were allowed. So that's 1967 was when people were proud to marry outside of their ethnicity as the society sees them. Obviously, the people in love are going to love it anyways, but again, society might be racist against them, prejudiced against them, and deny them of things. Did not consider biracial offspring pride, though, and that's something that is a major concern when you talk to parents who are parents of a biracial child. They start to think about, hey, this child's going to be living in a very different world than the one that I lived in if I was monoracial. There's also the variant approach, which is that multiracial identity is a unique category separate from monoracial identity, draws on sociology, psychology, anthropology, literature, and feminist studies, encourages the perspective that multiracial people have multiple understandings of their racial identities. So each person will see their cultures, their makeup in a very different way, which is really interesting and cool. Now let's talk about racial socialization. There are three approaches in this, which is the promotive, which is mothers emphasize equality and encourage a colorblind worldview. There is no preparation for or direct teaching about racial discrimination. So this parent will raise their child like they're just humans, okay, and that's it. So they don't prepare their child for racial attacks in the future or racial questions. And that child might not be able to answer it because they don't really know how to answer those things. So again, you can see how it could serve as a disservice, but you can also see how the goal or the intention of this is to be well-meaning, right? But does it prepare a child who's biracial to understand how mean other people can be? There's also the protective, prepares children for racial discrimination. So you're going to prep your children to be aware that racism will happen to you. Children are encouraged to be the best that they can be. Children are given a sense of self as a member of a racial group and taught to stand up for their rights but to be respectful. There's also the passive. Either do nothing to prepare their children for discrimination or did not answer the questions posed by the interviewer. So again, this one is they just don't care, right? Whereas the other one they're talking about is, we're humans, we should not think about those things. This one is, I don't think about those things and I don't care about those things per se. Mothers of Black and white biracial children seem to be more aware of the role that skin color plays in society, whereas parents of non-Black racial children may not have encountered negative racial experiences with their children. So what that is saying is mothers who are who have children who are half Black and let's say half white are much more aware of the racial issues than let's say someone who's half Asian and half white or half Latinx and half Asian. Okay. Now let's talk about multiracial and biracial identity development. So let's talk about the fact that let's say a person is biracial or multiracial. How do they decide what they are? Or if you ask them, how do they decide how they call themselves or what they call themselves? So there are four identities. There is a singular identity, which means even if you're biracial or multiracial, you'll identify as just either Black or white or whatever. And that's 14% will identify as Black, and then 4% will identify as white. The second one is called the border identity, which is exclusively biracial. So that means that you identify yourself as biracial. And this is the majority of the people who that's how they are self-identified when people ask them. Third one is called protein identity. Protein is just a fancy word of saying going back and forth, kind of flipping depending on the situation, let's say. So sometimes they're Black, sometimes they're white, sometimes they're biracial. And you're like, well, why do they do that? Well, society, the world can be a very mean place, okay? I'll give you an example. There is I think his name is Pete Wentz. He is a musician. He is half Black and half white, I believe. And he has very, very white features though. So for a while, he grew out a fro. He did dreads, he did cornrows, and people were like, dude, you're not Black. Why are you culturally appropriating my people or whatever, right? And so he didn't like to have all that negative feedback, I think. He didn't like people harassing him, calling him racist, calling him, an appropriator of culture, even though he is actually half Black and half white. So he's actually stopped doing those things because he just didn't want to. So you can see how, depending on the situation, which is like society in general, because they are awful people sometimes, right? That he would be maybe considered protein. Obviously, I don't know him and I don't know how he identifies, but just observing what he does now, which is he does not wear, have a fro or cornrows very often anymore publicly because he sees how people who don't know anything about him assume and then complain about him. And then there's the transcendent identity, which is not seeing a racial identity at all. The majority of the sample considered themselves to have border identities. Like we said before, of the four, border identity is the most popular. They say they experience their world as a Black person. With Jason, I believe is how you say this person's name, did a factor model of multiracial identity. So again, as we were talking about before, about how do people develop their identities, this is what they're saying is influencing or could be influencing each person's identity. First is racial ancestry or the family tree. So if you look at it, you will see and you will decide whether or not you're going to identify with certain types of people in your family. Early experiences and socialization which includes exposure to culture, such as food, music, holiday, dialect, and language, could be very important. Cultural attachment that may influence racial designations, such as physical appearance, which includes skin hue or skin color, their body shape, and their hair texture. Social and historical contexts such as the presence of other multiracial people or the 2000 census allowing people to choose more than one box to designate themselves racially or ethnically. So before, they were forced to choose one or the other, right? They didn't say choose more. And so that allows people to then be able to openly say, oh yeah, I am black and I'm white as well. Political awareness and orientation, which is connected to the awareness of race and racism within a larger socio-political context. Again, certain groups are not necessarily as friendly as other groups, so they might not identify as one if they want to belong in that group. Other social identities such as sexual orientation and social class can also influence this as well. Spirituality, which fosters connection to others and allow people to transcend the divisions of race and ethnicity. As you can see so far, you've noticed that there's a lot of models that talk about this because it's actually quite fascinating, quite new about biracial and multiracial identity. Kick in 1992 did a 3-stage biracial model for Japanese and white Americans. Awareness of differentness and dissonance between self-perceptions and the perception from other people. So being able to see yourself through yourself, but also being able to see how other people see you as well is important, right? Biracial people are often seen as different. Dissonance or discomfort about difference can occur when the comparisons process is regarded as devaluation. So, you know, when someone says, "Oh, you're white and black," right? That tone could make people feel bad about themselves, about the part of the fact that they're half black, or you know, usually that's because it has lower social status. I'm not saying that black people are worse, okay? That's, again, this is just a dialogue that we have in class to talk about these situations. Struggle for acceptance from others can extend into adulthood in the context of school or community settings. People might even ask you, what are you, right? Because they can't figure it out, but it sounds kind of rude and inappropriate, right? Especially if you don't know who that person is. Self-acceptance and the assertion of interracial identity. The person's ability to create congruent self-definitions rather than be determined by other definitions and stereotypes may be said to be the major achievement of biracial and bicultural. So what that is all saying is that however you see yourself, you should feel good about that, right? So if you are happy with who you are, right, that means that you're congruent. When you're not happy with who you are is when you're incongruent and it doesn't bode well because there's no balance. So what they're saying is for a biracial person is whatever they are and however they feel the same outside and in, you know, it's okay if other people also label them that as well. They are fine, that would be kind of like the place where they are able to reach self-acceptance. Poston model of biracial identity development with 5 linear stages. So there's 5 stages in the specific one that was developed in 1990. The first part is personal identity, seen among young children who have not developed group self-esteem. So you can see that they're slowly developing as a child, but they might not necessarily know who they are just yet, right? They're just other children playing with other children, and that's it. Choice of group categorization, person choosing a racial group to identify with. Ethnic background, neighborhood, and social supports are factors that can influence this choice. So depending on where you grow up, you might identify with a specific group. And you might not even be part of that group, right? If you're thinking about it in a more bigger picture way. But it tends to be that, you know, a lot of people of color tend to grow up in a specific area that have similar people, right? Then there is enmeshment or denial. Meshment is basically kind of like all put together, smushed together, like a mesh wire or something like that. So during this time period, we can say that there's upheaval and confusion about choosing a group with which to identify. So for some people, they don't really know. Am I white? Am I black? I don't know. Feelings of being in betwixt in between can characterize people who may not feel acceptance from either group. So then they don't feel like they're black enough, they don't feel like they're white enough, and then that can cause a lot of confusion and emotional distress, right? Which is what this stage they're talking about. Then there's appreciation, which is learning to accept their multiple identities, and then integration, which is an integrated place where people are able to celebrate all of who they are. And a lot of the things that they talk about here, it makes me think about those kind of like 23andMe tests that lets you know who you are or what you are, right? Your racial makeup. It's really interesting because some people are like, what? I didn't even know that that was part of me. But that just shows us the history, the diversity, the intermingling of races and stuff like that throughout the history of life. Sometimes people think that they're one thing and then they find out they're actually not at all, right? And it's not that because their parents are lying, but maybe their parents didn't even know either. So sometimes the records get lost and then legends or ideas or beliefs suddenly become very real to people. And having a genetic test will sometimes open up your eyes a little bit more. Now let's talk about implications for mental health professionals. Two identity tasks face biracial people. One is distinguishing how others see them from how they personally experience themselves, right? So how they see themselves is not how other people see themselves, and they need to realize that and be aware of how people may see them. Two, developing a sense of belonging. Being able to find a place where they feel like they're okay. Because again, like I said before, for some people who are biracial, white people might say that they're not white enough, and black people, let's say as the other half, might not say that they're black enough, right? And that can cause a lot of upheaval, a lot of emotional distress, like we talked about before. But to be aware of that if you're a professional in this field. It is suggested that children will internalize a variety of experiences and beliefs into their own value system that encompasses multiple identities and worldviews. So for people with biracial identities, they know that other people might not see them the same way and they're aware of it, right? But again, we hope that they are able to develop that strong sense of themselves so that they don't get hurt when other people say things. Racial identity development of multiracial youth is more complicated than for monoracial youth. And of course, that's very obvious. We've been talking about this entire time. Children can be very mean to each other. They might say something, and adults too, obviously, but the children might say, you're not black enough or you're not white enough if that child is biracial, black and white. Some children may feel enormous conflict about choosing one racial identity over another based on the child's phenotype. Phenotype is physical things that you can see on a person, like, there's the size of their nose, the color of their eyes, and stuff like that, the texture of their hair, neighborhoods, or race of the custodial parent if divorced. So let's say that this biracial child is being raised by one parent who, let's say the child is half Latinx and half Asian, right? And the mom is Latinx. So she might identify with Latinx just because of the fact that her mom is, right? So it really does influence and teach or let them decide how they're going to identify. Treating race as a social construction as opposed to a biological one was found to help buffer people from stereotype threat effects. So what that basically is saying is ultimately humans are humans, right? We are all the same inside in that way. So to be able to also teach them that even though we do have different physical characteristics, that we're all the same inside will help them feel a little bit better as well. So they don't feel like they have to pick and choose who they are, whether it is voluntarily or being forced to.